Greetings, this is the Digital Dog with another video tutorial. I thought that this would be a good opportunity to do a tutorial on the good old Photoshop color settings. The biggest, ugliest, gnarliest, complicated dialog box in all of Photoshop. Now I've had an article on my website for many years, but I figured for those of you who like to see things rather than read about them, I would do this particular tutorial on the color settings and go into detail on what all this fun stuff does. So I'm going to cancel. And to get into your color settings, you want to go into the Edit, Color Settings menu item, or for those of us who just like shortcuts, it is Command on the Mac, Control Shift K. Calls up your color settings. Command or Control K without the Shift key calls up your regular Photoshop preferences. Add the Shift key and you get your color settings. Now the first time you open this up, you may see that the dialog looks something like this. You'll notice there is a More Options button, and we want to see all the particular options here. We don't want to hide anything, so we're going to turn this on. And one of the things that I would suggest is, instead of looking at the entire dialog box in one straight view, which will make your head explode, what you want to do is break this down into sections. There's basically 6 sections. So let's go over the 6 sections. And I assure you that after we remove some of the sections from consideration, you'll see there isn't really that much going on here. So at the very top, we have a pop-up menu that has a number of settings. And some of these settings may look different than you see on your copy of Photoshop, depending on what version you're running. Many of these presets are installed by Adobe when you install Photoshop. So what do? They're just a quick way of toggling all the settings in the rest of the dialog box. So for example, if I were to select Emulate Acrobat 4, you'll notice that all of the items in this gigantic ugly dialog box have changed. If I go and I select Japan General Purpose 2, everything changes. So this is a very simple part of this dialog. These are just presets. And you can make your own. You'll notice I have one here called Andrew Settings. One of the things I'll just mention, if you want to cut this video short and make your life very easy, what you would do, this is my suggestion, is go into your presets and go to North America Prepress 2. Select that. Let it fill in everything within this dialog box. And then the only change that I would suggest, I prefer to be working in a larger color space for RGB than Adobe RGB. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to pick Prophoto RGB. Now, if you've done any of the reading on my website or been to any of my seminars, you know that I'm a proponent of Prophoto RGB, especially for people working in initially raw workflows. If you're working with Lightroom or Camera Raw, you want to bring your images in Prophoto RGB. Therefore, you want to set your working space for Prophoto RGB. And I'll talk about this in a second. You'll notice now that this pop-up says Custom. That's because I changed it. I changed one item. And now I can leave it as such. I could hit OK. But the other thing I could do is I could just come in here and I could click Save, and I can save this preset. And I could give it any title. We can call this New Saving. And if I hit Save, what will happen is I will get a custom.csf file. You can see I have 2 custom CSF files already. And I would just hit Save. I'm not going to do that. Consequently, if I want to load one of these particular files, I can just click on the Load button and load these settings. This is very nice if you have a lot of machines in your workflow and you want to do this configuration once and then send them to all the various machines and load them. Let me just briefly show you the path here on the Macintosh. So basically, if you go into your user library, Application Support, Adobe, Color, and then Settings, this is where these particular CSF files live. And you should see a little information below as to where they would reside under Windows. So this is a very simple setting. It's just presets. Now, one of the things, if you go and make a new setting, let's just do this real quickly. Let's toggle this. Let's say instead of ACE, we're going to pick a different CMM, and I'll get to that. If I click Save, I'm going to save this. Save this. I'm going to hit Save, and what you'll notice is I can come up and I can add a description here and type in whatever I want to show up down in this description area down below. So one of the things that you'll notice, let's go back to my settings, that as I move my mouse around different areas of this dialog box, the description down below gives us some online help. So of the 6 very complicated areas within this dialog, one of them is very simple. It's simply custom settings that you can select or make. And the one down below is simply an area that shows you what's going on within this dialog box. So now we really have nailed 2 of the 6 areas that we need to talk about. So let's talk about these working spaces, the next area in this dialog box. Basically, we have different color models that we can work with. And what this allows us to do is pick color spaces that we prefer to be working in. And as I said, I recommend that for people in a raw workflow, you pick Prophoto RGB for an RGB working space. Consequently, you can pick a color space for CMYK, grayscale, and spot. Now, if you never use these particular color spaces, then you don't have to worry about that. I would suspect that almost everyone is working at least initially in RGB. And what I'm doing here, I have a huge list of profiles. You'll notice at the very top of the list, I have some of the more common RGB working space profiles that are installed either by Adobe or, in the case of Melissa RGB, a profile that I made to emulate Lightroom. So it's very easy to pick your RGB working spaces. They'll generally be within this area of the list. You would never pick an output color space here, like a color space for your Epson, as you can see. So I'm going to pick Prophoto RGB. And what I'm telling Photoshop is that this is the color space I prefer to be working in. Now, this doesn't mean I can't work in other color spaces. It simply tells Photoshop, on this machine, I want to be working in Prophoto RGB. And if the document I'm working with isn't in Prophoto RGB, that is now where this second area, color management policies, is going to come into play. And we're going to spend a great deal of time in this tutorial talking about the policies, because this is really the meat and potatoes of this dialog box. Essentially, again, we have RGB, CMYK, and gray, much as we have up above. We're really only going to be dealing with RGB here. The settings are going to be the same for the other color spaces. So when it comes to these policies, we basically have 3 options. And one of them is so brain dead and silly, it really should be removed from the application. So you'll notice that on my settings, I have something called Preserve Embedded Profiles. This is a setting that I recommend you consider using in all cases. We have another setting called Convert to Working RGB, and then a third one called Off. The off setting would give you the idea that somehow you're turning off color management in Photoshop. This is absolutely not true. This is a fairly dangerous setting that I do not recommend. You are not turning off color management. You're basically setting up Photoshop to sort of ignore color spaces in images, and when you save images, removing them from them, not a good idea. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at all 3 of these very quickly in a tutorial. I'll open an image and give you an idea of what they do. And we'll just look at RGB because CMYK has the same settings. Grayscale has the same settings. So let's look at the preserve policies and how they work with these warning checkboxes. You'll notice there are 3 warning checkboxes, which are very important. To reiterate, I've told Photoshop I want to be working in Prophoto RGB. So if I open up an image in Prophoto RGB, it's just going to open without any particular dialogues popping or anything whatsoever. Let me click OK. I'll actually close this bunny file, and I'm going to open it again. And it happens to be in Prophoto RGB. I know that because one of the things I can do is come down here to the bottom of this document window, click on this little flyout triangle, and you'll notice that there are all kinds of options for setting feedback in individual document windows. You can set how long it takes to apply a certain effect or work that you're doing. You can look at the scratch size. I have this set for document profile. So anytime I open up a document, no matter what color space, I'm going to see that it is in this case Prophoto RGB. So one more time, I'm going to close this image and I'm going to open it up. And you'll notice Photoshop does nothing more than simply open the image. Why? Because in my color settings, I've asked for my preferred working space to be Prophoto RGB. And when I open up any document in Prophoto RGB, it simply opens up and I'm done. I'm ready to go edit my file. No particular error there. While we're talking about color space feedback, because I always like to give you a few more tips and tricks that are not absolutely color management specific, if I go up to my info palette here, one of the things that I am able to pick in my panel options that might be useful for you is document profile. So if I have that checkbox on, which I do, you'll notice here that I have information about the color space that I'm currently working in. This is a Prophoto RGB 16-bit image. So we have two possible ways of looking at feedback in terms of the color space of our document. All right, so this is fairly simple. We want to be working in Prophoto. We may be working in other color spaces. What is going to happen if we don't have Prophoto RGB embedded in the document we're going to open? Well, that's where these color management policies and checkboxes sort of kick in. The first thing you'll notice is we have something called Profile Mismatches, Ask When Opening. So essentially, if I open up a document that is not in Prophoto RGB, Photoshop is going to alert me to this and pop a dialog box. Let's take a look at that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up an image I know that is not in Prophoto RGB. I'm going to open up my printer test file. And you'll notice that before the document even opens, Photoshop has examined the document and it is determined that the embedded profile is color match RGB. It knows that my preferred RGB working space is Prophoto. So there's a mismatch here. What do I want to do? Well, I want to use the embedded profile instead of the RGB working space. I want to open the document in color match RGB. For whatever reason, this document came to me in color match RGB. It serves no purpose to convert it. I could select Convert Documents Color Space to the Working Space, which would then convert from color match into Prophoto. That serves no purpose. There was a reason why this image was originally configured in color match, and so I'm just going to leave the radio button where it is. That's the default thanks to the preserve policy, and just click OK, and the document opens. And we can see that it is in color match RGB. So in this particular case, because I have Preserve Embedded Profile, which is sort of the Switzerland of settings, let's let everybody get along. We don't care that you're not in Adobe or Prophoto or Ask, whatever you happen to set up here. We want to preserve what color space is in the particular document. But at the same time, we want to be informed of this with the profile mismatch. If I turn this off, notice it goes back to custom because I've changed something. I'm going to go OK. I'm going to close this document and I'm going to reopen it one more time. In this case, it just opens without a warning. Once you get comfortable with this particular behavior, you may want to turn off that particular warning option. Because I have this set for document profile here, I'm looking down every time I open up a document to see what the color space is, and it really may be more of a hassle than it's worth to have this particular checkbox on. In other words, Profile Mismatch, Ask When Opening. There's a mismatch between Prophoto and this document, so let me know when you open the document. I'm going to leave it for now. I think until you get tired of it always telling you what the mismatch is, you might want to leave this on. It's a good safety net. I'll go back to my settings, and of course it's on. So this is very, very simple. Select your RGB working space, select Preserve Embedded Profiles, select Profile Mismatch if you want to be informed when the two are out of sync. So now what happens if we change this from Preserve to Convert to RGB Working Space? I'm going to do that, hit OK, close this document, and reopen it. Now, the only thing I changed was the policy from Preserve to Convert. And what you'll notice is a very similar behavior we saw a minute ago. We still see it's in color match, RGB. We still know that our preferred working space is Prophoto RGB. The difference is now, because we selected the Convert policy instead of the Preserve policy, the radio button automatically now is selected for Convert Documents Color Space to the working space. And if I click OK, Photoshop is literally going to do a color space conversion from color match to Prophoto RGB. I'll say OK. Takes a slight bit longer to do. There was a conversion, and you'll notice down here now it says Prophoto. I've converted all of the data as I open the document. I don't think this is a very good idea in most cases. In fact, there are very, very, very rare cases where you're going to want to have that conversion take place automatically when you open up the document. I'll give you one example. Maybe you're a web designer. You always have to have sRGB to send to the web, and you're getting documents from all over. You want to make sure that everything ends up in sRGB. So what you could do, the first thing obviously, is you would change this to sRGB, and you would keep this to Convert to Working RGB, and you could actually turn this Profile Mismatch off, go OK. I'll close this, and once again I'll open it. The very first time you do this, this dialog box is going to come up, and it's going to say, are you sure you want to do this? This is sort of the Adobe Safety Net, and of course, if you were going to work this way, you would say don't show again. And now the document is in sRGB. And the next time I open up any document that is not in sRGB, I will get no warning. The document will just be converted into sRGB. So that is a little bit dangerous. I'm going to go back into my color settings, and let's turn our warning back on. And lastly, pick the off policy, just to show you how incredibly dangerous this particular option would be, especially with the warning off. I'll go OK. I will open this image one more time, and we get the same dialog box as we saw in the last two instances, but because our policy was set to off, we now have a very dangerous setting. Discard the embedded profile, don't color manage. Not a very good idea. Now, my working space, I didn't reset it to Prophoto, but that's okay for this illustration. It tells me that my RGB working space is sRGB. The document is color match RGB. And if I select discard the embedded profile, what's going to happen is the document is going to open as an untagged image. And Photoshop always has to make a guess as to the color space. And guess what that guess happens to be? It happens to be your RGB working space. So if I say discard the embedded profile, don't color manage, and hit OK, the image opens and it doesn't look quite right to me. And the reason it doesn't look right is because I'm working with untagged RGB data. It happens to be in color match RGB, we know that for a fact, but Photoshop is now handling it as if it were sRGB. If we go back into our color settings and we pick Andrew's settings, which uses Prophoto RGB, you notice the image looks absolutely hideous now, simply because the document, which is in color match RGB, is assumed now to be in Prophoto RGB, which we know is absolutely incorrect. So the off policy is very, very dangerous, and I don't recommend it. Let's close this document. We'll go back one more time and open it the old-fashioned way with the correct settings. We get this dialog box. And the beauty of having the Preserve Embedded Profile radio button on is all we really have to do is hit the OK button or hit the Enter key, and the document opens correctly. Okay? So the other two warning checkboxes are also quite useful. Missing profile, ask when opening, should always be on. Basically, if anybody feeds you a document that does not have an embedded profile, Photoshop is going to pop a dialog and tell you that it does not have an embedded profile. And the important thing to understand is the image is going to be previewed based on what you selected here for your preferred RGB working space. Untagged documents are very bad. You have RGB or CMYK mystery meat. Photoshop doesn't really know how to handle them. And in such a case, you want to find out why you're getting untagged documents and make that stop. You'll probably need to use the assign profile command to pick the right color space, assuming you know it. And if not, you're just going to have to make a bunch of guesses. And that's really problematic. So we want to know when we get untagged documents. The last is called ask when pasting. So let's leave that on and see what happens. So we have two documents here. One is in Color Match RGB and one is in Prophoto RGB. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go, just so we don't get an additional warning, I'm going to come in here very quickly just so you don't have to watch this. I'm going to adjust this to 8 bits per channel, and I'm going to select some data, and I'm going to edit, copy. So the data that I've just copied into the clipboard is in Prophoto RGB, and I'm going to paste it into a document that's in Color Match RGB. So I'm going to now go edit, paste, and I get this profile mismatch dialog because of the settings, the color settings where I have give me this dialog if I have a paste mismatch, which I do. The source is Prophoto. That was the bunny image. The destination is Color Match RGB. What do I want to do? So this is sort of Adobe speak, and it's a little bit complicated until explained, and then it kind of makes sense. You have two options: convert the data or don't convert the data. So if I say convert, what I'm saying is I want to preserve the color appearance. I want the pasted data to appear in the new document as it appeared in the other document. So if I go OK, you'll notice it's a smaller resolution, but the color matches, because what Photoshop did was it converted from Prophoto RGB into Color Match RGB and pasted the data into the Color Match document, and it preserved the color appearance. So now what I'm going to do is paste again. I get the same dialog box, but now I'm going to say do not convert. Preserve the color numbers. So basically we can preserve the color appearance, which means we must change the numbers, or we can say don't change the numbers, preserve the color numbers, and this is what we get. Clearly you can see that these images do not match. We have quite ugly looking color here. There are very rare cases where you're going to want to preserve those particular numbers. There are a few, but generally speaking, when you paste data, you're going to want to use the default, which is preserve color appearance. And as you can see, the color appearance is fine. Okay, going back into our color settings. The color management policies. This is really the meat and potatoes of this dialog. What we want to happen when we open documents that may be in a different color space than we've selected for our preferred color spaces, and how we want Photoshop to inform us when we paste data that is not in the same color space, when we open a document that is in a different color space, or when we open a document that has no defined color space. So I think this is really the meat and potatoes of this dialog box. In terms of its complexity. If you understand how this works, or if you just leave it set like this, all is good. Now this particular area is called conversion options, and you really can just completely ignore this, because the only time these particular settings kick in is if you do a mode change. So if you go Image, Mode, if I go RGB to CMYK or RGB to grayscale or what have you, basically I have to remember what was set in these color settings here, right? If I convert from RGB to CMYK, it's going to convert from Prophoto RGB, which is fine, into US swap coded V2. This is the preferred CMYK space that I've selected here. And it's going to do the conversion based on using the Adobe Ace color engine, which I recommend. It's going to use one of these rendering intents, and this is a problem because you need to select these based on the image itself. So right now we've locked in relative colorimetric. And we always want black point compensation on. That's a very good thing to have on. Use dither is useful in 8-bit images just to do a little smoothing, add some noise so that we get a slightly cleaner conversion. There are some rare times you may want to turn this off if you're doing some sort of scientific work or you're comparing different things that you don't want noise added that could complicate the data that you're reading. And then compensate for scene referred profiles. This may not be in the version of Photoshop you're using if it's an older version, and unless you're using After Effects, you can pretty much ignore this. So why is this not important? Well, basically, anytime you want to go from RGB to CMYK or CMYK to RGB or whatever, the best way to really do that is to go into Convert to Profile. Here, you can pick any color space you wish that's installed on your machine. So I can go from RGB to any of these CMYK profiles. I don't have to remember what was set in the color settings. So maybe I don't want to use swap coded. Maybe I want to use, I don't know, Grackle 2006. The other advantage is we get a soft proof. You'll notice that as I toggle these different color spaces, you'll probably notice it most in the spectral gradient. Well, especially if we go from CMYK to CMYK, but if we go CMYK to RGB, you can see there's a fairly radical difference on screen. So as we toggle these, we can see a soft proof thanks to this preview checkbox being on. And we can toggle our rendering intent. And if you look here, you'll notice that all of the settings that we need to do a color space conversion are in the Convert to Profile dialog. All the same settings here are here. In fact, there are more settings to Convert to Profile. So what I'm basically saying is you can just ignore this if you never use the mode change to convert from one color space to the other. You can just use Convert to Profile, and whatever sits here is moot. It has no bearing on what you're doing. You might as well just use the Convert to Profile command, get your soft proof, select your rendering intent visually, and not have to worry about any of this at all. Okay, look at this. We've gone through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the 6 settings. And this one's really simple. The advanced controls, this is the one that I would say don't touch. Just leave it alone. They're primarily big hurt me buttons that I would not even play with unless you're a super advanced user or you just like living dangerously. You can read about what desaturate monitor colors by does in my document on my webpage, but generally, well, I wouldn't say generally, I would say in the years that I've been using Photoshop, dating back to when this control was first implemented back in 1998, I've never used it. It's a very dangerous setting. So basically, my recommendation would be to leave this all alone and don't even touch it. Again, I would recommend Prophoto RGB. Select your color policies to preserve so that no matter what the color space of the document is, it just opens in Photoshop. You may want to be informed when it's a mismatch. And always have the Ask When Opening and Ask When Pasting checkboxes on. And then if you have to do any mode changes, just forget about all this and simply go into your Convert to Profile command. So that's basically the color settings in Photoshop. Thank you for your time and attention.